Welcome to the next installment in the series on how to write LGBT characters and why you should anyway. I am not going to reiterate everything I've said from the last 3 videos in this series and my top 11 worst LGBT tropes videos. So if you want more info about those, check those out. I will link the playlist various places for your ease of access. But today we are specifically going to talk about trans characters. Let's get down to business. Gratuitous Moonland reference there. You'll see why soon enough. You want to write a trans character? Yeah! Do it! But you're not sure how. Sad face. It's all good. I've got you covered. Obviously, the easiest way to show that a character is trans is to have them come out as trans within the narrative. But not only is this not really enough in itself, but sometimes you don't want to have them be there like, whunk, I'm trans. That's them landing, that's the whunk noise is the noise of them like jumping into view. So what kind of hints can you throw in your narrative to kind of imply to the audience, and maybe more than imply to the audience, that one of your characters is trans? Well, I'm going to split them into 3 sections: appearance, behaviour, and history/backstory. From here on out, I'm going to be using a trans man as a case study. We're going to build a trans man together. Let's call him Jim. Why a trans man and not a trans woman? Honestly, I have a lot more knowledge of trans men and what it's like to be a trans man than I do of trans women, just purely through how my life has come about and the people that I have met. If you wanted to write a story containing a trans woman, you can use some of these tips, but I would advise going to someone who has a little more knowledge of what it means to be a trans woman and the kind of experiences that trans women have, because I don't have knowledge of those particularly, and I definitely don't have enough knowledge to make an advice video about it. Still doing my research. Appearance wise, you have a fair few options. Is our trans man on testosterone? Has he had chest surgery? How have these things affected him? All of this kind of depends on your setting as much as on Jim himself. Remember, we called him Jim. There's nothing stopping you from making a magical potion that acts like a testosterone shot in a fantasy novel, if that's what you want to do. If he is on testosterone, or a magic potion like testosterone, or a sci-fi equivalent of testosterone, he could have facial hair. His musculature might be well defined. He could have a little or a lot of body hair. If he's had chest surgery, mundane or magical, he will obviously have a flat chest. But if he's shirtless at any point, you can describe his scars. If he hasn't had chest surgery, he's likely to wear baggy or layered shirts to disguise the shape of his chest. And maybe in a fantasy novel he doesn't go anywhere without a breastplate. Chest binders peek out of the top of shirts. They look like tank tops or vests. If you've got a low-cut arm, you'll see it here. Often, trans men can't find trousers that are short enough for their legs, because the average cis man is taller. Jim might struggle to find shoes that fit. He might cover his throat to hide a lack of Adam's apple. He could have noticeably small hands or narrow shoulders. Please don't use all of that all at once. That would be a lot, and it's definitely overkill. Try to avoid mentioning breast tissue or wide hips, as these can be pretty dysphoria-inducing to any trans people who happen to read it, and I presume you want trans people to read it? If you want to make a point about things like breast tissue and not having a flat chest, you can always say things like, Jim adjusted the way he sat, pulling at the open shirt overlaying his t-shirt, desperately trying to make it look flatter. Behaviour-wise, Jim could be reluctant to get changed in front of others. Even if he has had chest surgery, he might not want to show that off to the world particularly. I mean, he will still have scars. Again, if he is shirtless, you can describe the scarring. I'm pretty proud of my description in Hatchet Hangover over on nopoodles.wordpress.com and on my Let Me Read It For You playlist, right here on YouTube. You can always look up chest surgery results online and describe what those look like. If Jim gets injured, you can do the thing like in Mulan, told you that reference is coming, where Jim tries to shrug off the wound and ends up with bandages much farther up his chest than the point of view character would think they need to be. Note, do not have Jim, or whoever your trans character happens to be, binding with bandages day to day. That is dangerous, and we need to stop romanticising it and putting it out there in the world. Have Jim wear a proper binder made specifically to bind breasts in a safe way. Make the point that it was specifically made for this purpose. Make the point that it is safe. And try not to call it like a breast binder or a chest binder. No, call it a chest binder. Breast binder or breast band. Instead, call it something like a chest binder or a chest flattener or, I don't know, honestly, binder is a good word. You can have Jim taking testosterone within the story. Typical administration of a testosterone shot is 1 shot every 2 weeks, either by a nurse or by self-injection. If you're doing fantasy or sci-fi, you can have fun with that. You can change it up, make it into a testosterone patch, or make it into a potion, or make it into, I don't know, you could do anything, it's fantasy and sci-fi. You can compare it to birth control by noting a difference. The shining yellow of Jim's potion drew Amber's attention. Jim chugged the whole bottle, grimacing at the taste. Amber wondered what it was for. She only took the moon potion once a month, but Jim had been throwing back the yellow stuff once a week. Jim can ask if a piece of clothing makes him look too feminine, or feminine at all. He can ask what a public bathroom or changing room is like. These are just some of the behavioural things that indicate someone might be trans. Again, these aren't specific absolutes, but it's a good hint. When it comes to backstory and history, Jim is likely to avoid talking about his past wherever possible, especially if he doesn't want to come out. It's challenging to try and remember the tiny lies that you've told to conceal your gender and your assigned gender at birth. Having to censor yourself every time something implies a gender that isn't your actual gender is challenging. It will be difficult. Jim might hesitate when telling stories about his childhood. Yeah, I learned to make a fire when I was in, Cubs? The pause and the uncertainty tells us, the reader, that Jim could be lying about this. And if we already have the inkling that Jim might be trans, we can figure out that his pause is while he thinks, shoot, what is the male equivalent? What is the male equivalent? If we're inside Jim's head, you can actually physically have the reader hear that thought process. What is the male equivalent? Where would I learn to make a fire if I had been known to be a boy when I was young? Plenty of families are accepting and loving towards their trans children. You don't have to make Jim's family difficult, but you can if you want to. I mean, it's kind of a toss-up. My family loves me, even though I'm non-binary. They don't care. You can throw in little hints with gendered activities in your universe. If sewing is a typically feminine activity, someone could mention that they wouldn't expect a guy like Jim to be able to sew so well, and Jim can be like, yeah, my parents weren't really big on gender. Or, oh, I picked it up along the way, it's useful to be able to mend your own clothes. Or, I've stitched wounds before. Fabric is hardly any different. Or you can have Jim be silent and start stitching in private, or stop stitching altogether. Jim is unlikely to volunteer information about his past, possibly to the extent that he even avoids his hometown, or the town he grew up in, even if his family is supportive. Why? Because the town you grew up in is a high risk. Not everybody there knows that you're trans, so the likelihood of being outed without your consent is much higher than anywhere else. Of course, you could also use that as a point of tension. Maybe Jim has to go back, and then maybe Jim has to come out to the rest of your band of characters. Remember that the best way to write a trans character is a meld of some of these hints and the character telling people that they're trans. Whether it's one person, just to themselves, or everyone. Whether Jim proudly wears a "this is what trans looks like" t-shirt, or whispers that he's trans to a good friend when he needs someone to have his back, or when he needs to go to a doctor's appointment, or when he's been stabbed. Because it's a high fantasy setting in my mind, because that's what I wrote. So there you have it. Those are my top tips for writing trans characters. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, you can give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to get the rest of the series. Check out the other videos that I've already made, all the way from Ida Hobbit to now. If you'd like to stay up to date with my life, my work and my bunnies, you can follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook as No Poodles. And if you'd like to support what I do, there is a link to my Ko-fi account in the description below. So what kind of... Oh, Jim might struggle to their character, but you can always look up chest sew, whether Jim proudly wears a "this is what trans shirt looks like." Trans shirt looks like? Social media, I am on Facebook